My mother winked at my father across the church basement. My father laughed and said, "She'll never know." What he did not realize was that I was standing 6 feet away. What he really did not realize was that my phone was in my coat pocket, screen down, with the recording app on, and had been for 45 minutes. Every word my parents had said about how they had cut me out of my grandfather's will was now sitting in a file I would never have to wonder about again. They had just buried him that morning. They had also just buried themselves. They simply did not know it yet. My name is Isha Maitland. I am 31 years old. I work as an investigative reporter for a small newspaper in upstate New York. I cover local government corruption mostly. School board contracts, town council bribery, the small everyday fraud of small everyday places. The kind of stories nobody at a major paper would touch, but the kind that destroy actual people's lives in the towns they happen in. I am very good at what I do. I have been recording conversations for a living since I was 24 years old. I know exactly what is admissible. I know exactly what is not. I know the recording laws in 3 states. New York is a one-party consent state, which means that as long as one person in a conversation knows they are being recorded, the recording is legal. The one person who knew that afternoon at the funeral was me. My grandfather had been dead for 4 days. My parents had spent those 4 days laughing at me behind my back because they thought they had successfully cut me out of his will, and they thought I was too distracted by my grief to notice what they had done. What they had done was something they had been working on for almost a year. And what I had been doing for the same year, without knowing what I was building, was assembling the evidence that was going to undo it. Before I tell you what was on the recordings I had been collecting for 12 months, hit subscribe. And tell me one thing in the comments. Tell me about a moment in your life when you witnessed something you were not supposed to witness, and what you did with it. I read every single comment. Now let me take you back to the year before my grandfather died. Before I tell you what was on the recordings I had been collecting for 12 months, hit subscribe. And tell me one thing in the comments. Tell me about a moment in your life when you witnessed something you were not supposed to witness, and what you did with it. I read every single comment. Now let me take you back to the year before my grandfather died. I want to tell you about my grandfather first, because the story does not work without him. His name was Arthur Maitland. He was 82 when he died. He had been a high school history teacher for 41 years in the same small town in Vermont where he had grown up. He had married my grandmother when he was 24. They had built a small log cabin on a lake, an hour north of their house, when my mother was a baby. The cabin had been the center of our family for 50 years. I had spent every summer there from the time I could walk. I had learned to swim in that lake. I had read my first chapter book on the porch of that cabin. I had fallen asleep 1,000 times to the sound of loons calling on the water. My sister Whitney had been to the cabin maybe 4 times in her entire life. Whitney is 2 years younger than me. She is what people in my family call a city girl, which is the polite way of saying she does not like dirt or quiet or things that do not have Wi-Fi. She had decided sometime in her teens that the lake cabin was boring. She had stopped coming up. By the time we were adults, she had not been to the cabin in over a decade. Our grandparents loved both of us. Of course they did, but the cabin had a particular relationship with one of us, and not the other one, and everybody in the family knew it. My grandmother died when I was 23. After she died, my grandfather started to spend more and more time at the cabin alone. He said the house in town reminded him too much of her. The cabin reminded him of her too, but in a different way, in the way that a place can hold somebody's memory without holding their grief. I started driving up to see him most weekends. I would bring groceries. I would help him fix the things that were always breaking. I would sit on the porch with him in the evening while he told me stories about his teaching career, about my grandmother as a young woman, about people in their town who had been dead for 30 years. 2 years ago, when I was 29, my grandfather started to forget things. Small things at first, where he had put his keys, the names of his neighbors, then bigger things, the day of the week, why he had walked into the kitchen. The doctor said it was the early stages of dementia. He told us to expect a slow decline. He told us to make the most of the time we had with my grandfather while he was still himself. I started a project that summer. I had been thinking about it for a while. I asked my grandfather if he would let me record him telling the stories of his life. I told him I wanted to write a memoir for him as a gift that the family could keep. I told him we would do it slowly, 1 or 2 afternoons a month, just sitting on the porch with my recorder running. He said yes. He said he would love that. For 12 months, every time I drove up to the cabin, I recorded him. I recorded him talking about my grandmother. I recorded him talking about his parents. I recorded him talking about teaching. I recorded him talking about the cabin itself, about how he had built it, about every weekend he and my grandmother had spent there as young people. I recorded him talking about me, sometimes, about what he hoped my life would look like, about what he was proud of in me. I recorded him talking about Whitney, about how he wished she had come to the cabin more, about how he hoped she would find peace in her life eventually. I recorded him on 3 different afternoons spread across the year, telling me very specifically what he wanted to happen to the cabin after he was gone. I did not realize at the time that what I was actually building was an evidence file. I was building a memoir. I thought I was building a memoir. The recordings were going to be transcribed and turned into a book that the family would read together. I had no idea that 12 months into the project, my parents would do what they did, and that the recordings would become the thing that proved them wrong. Here is what my parents did. 6 months before my grandfather died, when his dementia had progressed to a point where he was sometimes confused about what year it was, my mother started visiting him much more often. She had not visited him much in the previous 20 years. Suddenly, she was driving up to the cabin almost every week. My father went with her. They brought groceries, they cooked him meals, they sat with him in the evenings. I noticed it. I thought it was strange. I also thought it was nice. I had been driving up alone for years, and the new attention from my parents looked, on the surface, like the kind of family closeness people develop when they realize their parent is dying. I gave them the benefit of the doubt. That was the first mistake I made. What I did not know was that during these visits, my parents were slowly, methodically, reshaping my grandfather's understanding of who in the family deserved what. My mother would say things like, "Do you remember how Whitney used to come up here? How she used to love it?" My grandfather, in his confused state, would nod and try to remember. My mother would help him remember things that had not happened. She would say, "Do you remember when Whitney made you that birthday card when she was 7? She would describe the card. My grandfather would say, yes, he remembered. The card had never existed. She did this for months. She built a false history of Whitney and the cabin in my grandfather's failing memory. She erased the actual history of me and the cabin in the same breath by not mentioning it. She told my grandfather repeatedly that Whitney had been talking about wanting a place where she could spend more time outdoors, that Whitney had been struggling, that Whitney needed a fresh start. She told him this many times. She brought it up in slightly different ways every visit. 4 months before he died, my grandfather, in a state of confusion my parents had carefully cultivated, signed an updated will. The new will left the cabin and the entirety of his savings to Whitney. It left nothing to me. The new lawyer who had drawn it up was a young attorney from a town an hour away, who had never met any of us before, and who had taken my grandfather's instructions at face value because he had no reason to think anything was wrong. My parents had found that lawyer themselves. They had chosen him because he did not know us. They had driven my grandfather to his office. They had sat in the waiting room while my grandfather signed the documents. They had taken him home afterward and told him they had had a nice day out. My grandfather had not told me about the new will. He probably did not remember signing it the next morning. He had told me on 3 different recordings during that same 6-month period that he wanted me to have the cabin. He had told me that he wanted Whitney to have the savings, but the cabin was for me because I was the one who knew it, who had loved it, who would take care of it. He had said this clearly, on tape, on 3 separate afternoons, in a voice that was sometimes confused about other things, but never confused about that. The recordings were on a hard drive in my apartment. They had been there for the entire time my parents were rewriting my grandfather's understanding of his own family. When he died, I did not know about the new will. The will reading was scheduled for a week after the funeral. I went to the funeral expecting to be remembered the way I had always been remembered. I went to the funeral with my recording app on, the way I always did at any family event, because I had learned a long time ago that family events were the same as town council meetings, and you record them for the same reason. People say things at family events that they will deny later. You want the proof. I have never been so glad I had a habit. After the funeral, after my parents winked at each other in the church basement, after my father said, "She'll never know," I drove home. I did not say anything to anybody. I went back to my apartment. I made myself a strong cup of tea. I sat at my desk. I plugged my phone into my computer. I downloaded the audio file. I opened it. I put on my headphones. I clicked play. For the next 45 minutes, I sat very still and listened to my own parents destroy themselves. What I heard was almost more than I had hoped for. My parents had been talking, throughout the funeral, about how successful their plan had been. They had used full sentences. They had named the lawyer. They had laughed about how confused my grandfather had been at the office. They had talked about how they had told Whitney about it the day after the signing, and how she had been so happy. They had talked about how Whitney was going to sell the cabin within a year, because she had no use for it. They had estimated the value of the property. They had calculated what their cut would be because Whitney had agreed, apparently, to give them a percentage in exchange for what they had done. The number they came up with was $140,000. $140,000 for telling lies in front of a confused old man for 6 months. There was one moment, in the middle of the recording, where my mother said something I keep coming back to even now. She said, "He kept asking me where Isha was. I told him she was busy with work. He believed me. He believed everything I told him by the end." I had to pause the recording when she said that. I had to take my headphones off. I had to walk into my kitchen and stand at the sink for a few minutes, because the part of me that had been my grandfather's granddaughter for 31 years was making a sound I did not want to hear in my own apartment. He had been asking for me. In his confused last months, he had been asking for me, and my mother had been telling him I was too busy to come. I was not too busy. I drove up every other weekend. I had been there the weekend before he died. She had been intercepting him. She had been telling him I had stopped coming while I was actively still coming because she wanted him to feel abandoned by me. She wanted him to think I did not care. She wanted to harvest his confusion into a will that left her favorite child everything. I went back to the desk. I put the headphones back on. I listened to the rest of the recording 3 times. I made notes. I time-stamped every key admission. I took screenshots of the relevant moments in the audio waveform. By the time I was done, I had a full transcript of everything they had said, with timestamps. I had a list of every person they had named. I had a complete map of the conspiracy. Then I opened the hard drive of my grandfather's recordings. I pulled the 3 files where he had specifically talked about his wishes for the cabin. I listened to those too. I cleaned up the audio. I made transcripts of those as well. I had 2 stacks of evidence. The first stack was the audio of my parents discussing what they had done. The second stack was the audio of my grandfather, in his own voice, describing what he wanted. The 2 stacks contradicted each other completely, and I was the only person who had both. I called a will contest attorney named Yelena Voss the next morning. I had interviewed her for a story about elder fraud the previous year. She remembered me. I told her what I had. She asked me to come to her office. I drove down that afternoon. She listened to both stacks of audio. She did not interrupt. She made notes. When she was done, she said, "Isha, this is the strongest elder fraud case I have seen in 15 years of doing this work. You have the perpetrators on tape admitting to the fraud. You have the victim on tape clearly stating his actual wishes. You have a documented progression of his cognitive decline through the recordings, which actually corroborates your case rather than undermining it, because you can hear the moments where the manipulation would have been easiest. We can absolutely contest the new will. We will win. The only question is how loud you want this to get." I thought about that for a long minute. Then I asked her if I could do something before we filed the contest. I asked her if I could bring my parents and my sister into a room and play them the recordings first. Before the lawyers got involved, before this became a court case, before they had the chance to start lying about what had happened, because the moment I filed, they would lawyer up, and they would lie, and the truth would get buried under whatever story they constructed in self-defense. Ms. Voss looked at me for a moment. She said, "That is unusual. Most of my clients want to keep the surprise. They want the courtroom moment." "I do not want a courtroom moment," I said. "I want them to see my face when they realize they were caught. I want them to know that the daughter they thought was too distracted to notice has had them on tape for a year. I want it to land in front of them. The courtroom is for the legal part. This is the personal part." She nodded. She said, "I will draft a letter inviting them to a meeting, framed as a discussion about your grandfather's wishes. I will not mention the contest. They will think we are trying to negotiate. They will come." She was right. They came. The meeting was on a Wednesday afternoon. Ms. Voss had a small conference room in her office. She had set out water glasses and a pitcher. There were 5 chairs. My parents arrived first. They were dressed nicely. My mother was wearing a navy blazer. She had the careful expression of a woman who was preparing to be polite about something she was about to win. My sister Whitney came in 5 minutes later, in a black sweater and sunglasses she did not take off. Ms. Voss sat at the head of the small table. I sat next to her. My parents and Whitney sat across from us. Ms. Voss began by thanking them for coming. She said we wanted to discuss some questions that had come up about my grandfather's recent will. My mother started to speak. Ms. Voss raised one finger gently. She said, "Before we go further, my client would like to share some context, with your permission." My mother said, "Of course." She was smiling. I opened my laptop. I clicked on the first audio file. I had queued it up to a specific timestamp. I pressed play. The voice that came out of the laptop was my mother's voice, from the funeral, saying very clearly, "We told him exactly what to think for 6 months. By the end, he believed Whitney had practically grown up in that cabin. He signed the will and didn't even ask questions." My mother's smile did not move for almost 3 seconds. Then it collapsed. The whole face, all at once, the way a wall collapses when you remove the wrong support beam. I let the recording keep playing. My father's voice came on. He was laughing. He said, "She'll never know. We can keep her out of every conversation from here on out. Whitney gets the cabin, we get our cut, and Isha can write her little newspaper articles about other people's families." My father, in real time, in the conference room, made a sound that was somewhere between a cough and a moan. He put his hand flat on the table. Whitney, behind her sunglasses, had not moved at all. I could not see her eyes, but I could see her mouth, and her mouth was open. I let the recording play for 2 more minutes. Every admission, every name, every laugh, every estimated value of the property, every reference to Whitney's agreement to give them a cut, every time my parents called my grandfather confused, used the word easy, used the word manageable. The cruelest words, in the cruelest order, in their own voices, at the funeral, 4 days after the man whose memory they had butchered for money was buried. I stopped the recording. I looked at them. I let the silence sit for about 10 seconds. I did not feel triumphant. I felt the strange flatness I always feel at the end of a long story I have been working on. The way you feel when the truth finally lands. "I have more," I said, "but I do not think you need to hear it." My mother said, "Isha." "Don't," I said. "I am not finished. I have something else for you to hear." I clicked on the second file. I had queued it up too. I pressed play. My grandfather's voice came out of the laptop. He sounded tired. He sounded like himself. He said, "I want Isha to have the cabin. She is the only one who comes up here. She is the only one who knows where the well is, and which floorboards are loose, and how to start the wood stove when it is too cold for the new way. The cabin needs a person who knows it. Whitney can have the savings. That is the right way to split it. I have been thinking about this for a long time. Don't let anybody tell you any different." The recording was time-stamped, October 14th, 2 months before he had signed the new will. I stopped the audio. I closed the laptop. "Ms. Voss is filing a contest of the will tomorrow," I said. "The new will is going to be invalidated because my grandfather did not have the cognitive capacity to make those decisions, and because my parents engaged in a clearly documented campaign of elder fraud to manipulate him. The recordings will be entered as evidence. There will be a judge. There may be additional charges depending on what the prosecutor decides to do. I want you to know that I am not the one bringing those charges. The state of Vermont will be. Mom, Dad, you committed a crime. You committed it slowly over 6 months, against an old man with dementia who was your father and your father-in-law, who loved you both and trusted you both. You committed it for $140,000. I want you to think about that number. $140,000 to spend the last 6 months of your father's life lying to him while he was confused about what year it was. You should have been holding his hand. You were holding a pen for him instead while he signed away things he had already given to me." My mother was crying. My father had not moved. Whitney had taken off her sunglasses. I could see her eyes for the first time. She was looking at me. "Whitney," I said, "did you know?" She did not answer. "Whitney," I said again, "I am asking you a serious question. Did you know what they did? Did you agree to give them a cut?" She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I knew about the will. I did not know how they got him to sign it. I thought he had just decided. They told me he had just decided." "Did you agree to give them money?" "Yes." "How much?" $140,000. They said it was for taking care of him." I nodded. I had wondered if she would lie about it. She had not. That was something. "Whitney," I said, "I am going to give you a chance. The contest is being filed tomorrow. Once it is filed, you are part of the legal proceeding. Your name is going to be in the documents. You are going to be deposed. Anything you say now is on the record. So I am going to ask you, one time, what you want to do. You can fight the contest with Mom and Dad. You can lose because we are going to win. You can have your name in the public record forever, attached to elder fraud, or you can withdraw your claim to the cabin right now, voluntarily, before the contest is filed. If you withdraw, your name will not be in the public part of the case. Your role will be reduced to a minor footnote. It is your choice. She did not look at our parents. She did not hesitate. I withdraw, she said. I am sorry. I should have asked harder questions. I knew it was strange. I let myself believe it because they made it easy to believe. I am sorry, Isha. I will let you know if I am ready to talk to you again, I said. It will not be soon, but it might be eventually. She nodded. She got up. She left the conference room without looking at our parents. My parents stayed. They tried to say several things. I did not stay to hear any of them. I packed my laptop. I shook Ms. Voss's hand. I walked out of the office. The will contest was filed the next morning. It took 11 months to resolve. We won. The original will was reinstated. The cabin came to me. The savings, which my grandfather had wanted to go to Whitney, did go to Whitney, because she was named in the original will too, just for a smaller amount than the rewritten one had given her. My parents were charged by the state with elder fraud and undue influence. The case was settled with a fine and a probation period because they were first-time offenders and because my grandfather was no longer alive to testify. They will not see prison. They will see the rest of their lives knowing what they did, and knowing that I have it on tape, and knowing that I am the daughter who is patient enough to keep things on tape for as long as it takes for the truth to be useful. I have not spoken to them in almost a year. They have written. I have not responded. Whitney and I have had 2 phone calls. They were short. They were honest. I do not know yet what we are going to be to each other. I am open to finding out, slowly. I spend every other weekend at the cabin. I have started writing the book about my grandfather that I had originally intended the recordings for. I sit on the porch in the morning with a notebook. The lake is the same lake it has always been. The loons still call it sunset. I have not changed anything in the cabin. I have not even moved the chair he used to read in. It is exactly where he left it. Some mornings I sit in it. Some mornings I do not. I am still figuring out which mornings are which. Here's what I want you to know, because I think it is the part that matters. There are people in your life who will rewrite history while you watch them do it, because they assume you are not paying enough attention to remember what really happened. They count on you being distracted. They count on you being too busy. They count on you being too kind to suspect them. They count on you being too tired, after everything else they have made you carry, to bother documenting the things they say in front of you. The most dangerous thing about being underestimated is that the people doing the underestimating tell you the truth. They speak openly in front of you. They laugh. They say the quiet parts out loud. They do this because they have decided, somewhere in their minds, that you do not matter enough to remember. Pay attention to what people say when they think you are not listening. That is the only version of them that is real. Everything else is a performance for somebody else's benefit. The version of your mother that is sweet to you in front of guests is not the real version. The version of your father that is reasonable in family arguments is not the real version. The real version of any person is the one that comes out when they think nobody important is in the room. If you are the unimportant person in the room, then congratulations. You are the only person who has met the real them. That is a kind of power. Most people never get it. You have it. Use it. You do not always have to use it now. Sometimes you store it. You store it the way I stored my parents' voices for 45 minutes at a funeral, on a phone in a coat pocket, without knowing yet what I was going to do with it. The story arrives later. Your job is to listen, to remember, and to write down what you saw, even if you do not write it down for anybody but yourself. The truth keeps. It does not spoil. It will be there when you need it. I want to ask you something before you go. I want you to think about a moment in your own life when somebody said something in front of you that they should not have said. A small thing, maybe a big thing, something they assumed you were not listening to. Tell me in the comments what they said. You do not have to give names. You do not have to give context. Just write the sentence, the one that has stayed with you. The one you remember word for word, even though they said it in front of you like you were not in the room. Tell me, there are more of us than you think. We have all heard things we were not supposed to hear. Sometimes saying it out loud, in a place like the comments of this video, is the first step in deciding what to do with it. I will be reading every single comment. I will see you in the next one.